Hello and welcome to Law Minds. In this video, I'll be discussing the two important concepts under the tort law, namely strict liability and absolute liability. Strict liability and absolute liability are legal doctrines that hold individuals or entities accountable for damages resulting from their actions, regardless of their fault or negligence. In tort law governing individual rights and responsibilities, strict liability imposes responsibility for damages caused by hazardous items or activities on one's property, as seen in the case of Rylance versus Fletcher, which we will be discussing later. The exceptions that exist within the strict liability rule are situations involving acts of nature, the plaintiff's consent, the plaintiff's default, actions by third parties, and instances of statutory authority. In contrast, absolute liability mandates individuals to bear full responsibility for damages arising from inherently risky activities without exceptions. Both the doctrines are crucial in safeguarding the environment and human rights, serving as obstructions and reflecting evolving societal values in tort law. Let's first understand strict liability. The rule of strict liability emerged from the legal case of Rylance versus Fletcher in 1868. This principle establishes that anyone who keeps hazardous substances on their property is accountable if these substances escape and cause damage. In this case, Fletcher operated a mill and constructed a reservoir on his land for its power source. An accident led to water from the reservoir flooding Rylance coal mines, which prompted Rylance to sue Fletcher. The court in this case determined that Fletcher had constructed the reservoir at their own risk, holding them accountable for any accidents or material escapes resulting from it. Now, some of the essential conditions to establish the rule of strict liability are: number 1, dangerous substance; number 2, escape; and number 3, non-natural use. In dangerous substances, this suggests that the defendant would only be held accountable for damages if anything hazardous escaped from their property. The term dangerous refers to the potential for harm if it leaves the defendant's premises. In the previous example, it was the toxic water accumulated in Fletcher's pool. The law specifies that items such as fuel, electricity, explosives, flagpoles, noxious fumes, vibrations, yew trees, sewage, and even exposed wires can be considered hazardous if they escape the owner's premises. Coming to the second condition, escape. Another crucial aspect of strict liability is the concept of escape, which dictates that anything causing harm to another person, once it leaves the property of the person responsible for it, should not be within the reach of others. For instance, if person A cultivates dangerous plants that can cause serious harm to anyone or anything consuming them, and if person B's sheep consumes these plants because some fell on B's land, person A will be liable to compensate person B for their loss. However, if person B's sheep wanders into A's land and consumes the plant, then person A will not be held accountable for the loss. The third condition is non-natural use. This principle indicates that if stored water is used for a natural purpose, such as domestic use, a person cannot be held accountable for any resulting harm. However, if the water is employed for a non-natural purpose, as in the case of Rylance versus Fletcher, where the defendant used the land to create a reservoir benefiting their mill, consequently posing a danger to others, they would be held liable for any resulting losses of the plaintiff. The rule of strict liability comes with some exceptions. Now, the first exception is the plaintiff's default. If the damage is caused solely by the act or default of the plaintiff himself, then he has no remedy. In Rylance versus Fletcher, this was noticed as a defense. If a person knows that there is a danger of his mine being flooded by his neighbor's operations on an adjacent land, and still pursues the danger by doing some act which renders the flooding probable, he cannot complain. In the case of Pointing versus Noax, the claimant's horse reached over the defendant's boundary, nibbled on some poisonous tree there, and died after consuming it. It was held that the claimant could not recover anything, for the damage was due to the horse's intrusion, and alternatively, there had been no escape of vegetation. The second exception is the act of God. The act of God defense applies when the escape is directly caused by natural occurrences without human involvement in situations beyond human foresight and not reasonably foreseeable by human judgment. This defense was acknowledged by Justice Blackburn in Rylance versus Fletcher and was then employed in Nichols versus Marsland case. In this case of Nichols versus Marsland, the defendant had artificial ornamental lakes created by damming a natural stream for many years. A highly unusual rainfall, unprecedented in the memory of witnesses, caused the artificial embankments to collapse, leading to the escape of water that destroyed 4 bridges. The court in this case ruled in favor of the defendant as the jury found no negligence on her part, determining that she should not be held responsible for an extraordinary natural event that she could not have foreseen or reasonably expected. The third condition is statutory authority. Statutes can override the rule established in Rylance versus Fletcher. The case of Green versus Chelsea Waterworks Company illustrated the following. A waterworks company authorized by Parliament to lay a main faced a burst in the main without any negligence on their part, causing flooding at the plaintiff's premises. In this case, the company was not held liable. In a similar scenario in Charing Cross Electricity Company versus Hydraulic Power Company, however, the defendants were deemed liable without any exemption under their statute. The key difference lies in the statutory powers, which is a hydraulic power company had permissive but not mandatory authority to supply water for industrial use, while they were not obliged to maintain high pressure water in their mains. Conversely, Chelsea Waterworks Company was mandated by statute to lay mains and maintain an uninterrupted water supply. As occasional bursts were an inevitable outcome of their operations without negligence, the statute impliedly exempted them from liability in such cases. The fourth exception to the rule of strict liability is the consent of the plaintiff. If the plaintiff has given clear and implicit permission for the existence of a potential danger, and the defendant has not acted negligently, then the defendant cannot be held responsible. This exception essentially demonstrates the general defense of voluntaria non fit injuria. Implied consent is commonly applied in situations involving various individuals, such as a tenant on a lower floor experiencing damage due to water leakage from an upper floor. It is noteworthy that cases discussing this defense often revolve around typical domestic installations, which by modern standards would be considered a natural use of the property. The last exception to this rule is the act of a third party. If a damage occurs due to the actions of an unrelated individual, someone not under the control or employment of the defendant, then the defendant will not be held accountable according to this rule. For example, in Box versus Jubb, when outsiders blocked a drain leading to the overflow from the defendant's reservoir, the defendant was found to be not responsible. Likewise, in Richards versus Lathian, where strangers obstructed waste pipes controlled by the defendants and turned on a tap, causing water to overflow and damage the plaintiff's belongings, the defendants were not held liable. Now coming to the concept of absolute liability. Absolute liability is a legal concept that holds individuals or entities accountable for the outcomes of their actions, regardless of culpability. This is relevant in situations where the involved activity carries inherent hazards or risks to others or the environment. The key components of absolute liability rule include: number 1, hazardous substance. The source causing harm must possess inherent danger like explosives, chemicals, gas, or electricity. The second component is escape. The hazardous source must be released from the control of its possessor or operator. The third component is non-natural land use. The individual or entity must utilize the land in an unconventional manner, such as housing or producing hazardous material. And the last component is mischief. The release of the hazardous material must result in damage or injury to another individual or property. The evolution of absolute liability in India. traces back to the tragic Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984. This catastrophe, caused by a methyl isocyanate gas leak from a pesticide plant, led to numerous casualties. In the legal case of MC Mehta versus Union of India, also known as the Oleum gas leak case, the Supreme Court introduced the principle of absolute liability. This concept, broader and more stringent than the strict liability doctrine which was established in the case of Rylance versus Fletcher, mandates that any enterprise involved in hazardous activities causing harm through accidents must compensate victims without exception or defense. Additionally, the Supreme Court specified that compensation should align with the enterprise's scale and the harm inflicted. From what has been discussed so far, we can distinguish absolute liability from strict liability with the help of the following 3 points. The first point is strict liability permits defenses like an act of God, plaintiff's consent, plaintiff's default, statutory authority, or an act of a third party, while absolute liability does not allow any defenses. The second point is strict liability pertains to non-natural land usage, whereas absolute liability covers any inherently hazardous activity irrespective of land use. The third point is strict liability is grounded in social justice, while absolute liability is rooted in social welfare. Absolute liability functions as a deterrent and precautionary measure, ensuring enterprises undertaking hazardous activities take necessary precautions to prevent harm to others or the environment. It also guarantees adequate compensation and rehabilitation for victims. The absolute liability rooted in Article 21 and 48A of the Indian Constitution mirrors the constitutional duty of both the state and its citizens to protect and improve the environment. In conclusion, the concepts of strict liability and absolute liability serve as crucial legal doctrines that establish responsibility and accountability in cases of harm or damage caused by certain activities or products. While strict liability holds individuals or entities accountable for damages regardless of fault, absolute liability imposes complete responsibility for hazardous activities or inherently dangerous substances. These legal principles continue to shape the framework for liability, fostering a balance between protecting the rights of victims and ensuring the imposition of appropriate legal obligations on those engaged in potentially risky acts or industries. Understanding these legal principles is essential to navigating the complexities of liability and ensuring justice and fairness in legal proceedings. This will be all for the video. Thank you.